Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 99, and today I'm in conversation with Jaime Clarke-Soles. It was a great pleasure to sit down and talk to Jaime Clarke-Soles. She's the Professor of New Testament, the Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. She recently published a book called Women in the Bible. It's out from Westminster John Knox Press. It's excellent. And having read the book, I invited her to come onto the podcast to talk to me about it. And I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Absolutely delighted to be chatting today to Jaime Clarke-Soles, the author of lots of things, but the one that we're talking about today that is the occasion for this podcast is this wonderful new book, Women in the Bible, Jaime Clarke-Soles, which has only been out a few months. Is that right to say, Jaime?
That is, yes.
And it has stunning endorsements. I mean, seriously, there's a who's who of scholars in the New Testament that are endorsing this book and speaking about it as being wonderful, as being clear. Now, I have read this book and I found it, I just want to begin with full on praise and say it is so clearly written. It is so compelling. It made me think dozens and dozens of new thoughts. And there's nothing more exciting than that when you're reading a new book. May I begin just by asking you what the origins of this project were? It's in the interpretation series, right? So was this something, did you approach them? Did they approach you? What was the origins of the project?
Yeah, so good question. First of all, thank you for those very kind words. It means a lot, especially coming from somebody, coming from you and your esteemed scholarship. And I can't express enough gratitude to the people who did endorse it, upon whose work I relied heavily as well in writing the book. So yeah, the origins of the book. I did not approach the publisher about this. I was approached, and back then I was a junior scholar, and I was in the habit of saying yes to things. Someone wants me to write a book. Wow, yes, absolutely. So I did ask why they chose me, because at that point, I had not written anything on women in the Bible. I had not written in a way you would identify me as a feminist scholar. And that was one of the reasons they gave for inviting me. That I brought something different to the table for this series and its audience and its aims. So to answer your question, the short answer, I was approached. I said yes, which is part of the reason I think that it took me so long to really finally land on a structure, a scope. It took a long time for me to figure that part out. Whereas had I sent in a book proposal and been seeking a contract, I would have thought of that ahead of time.
So how long have you been working on it? Or how long had you been working on it?
So it took a decade. I'd have to go back and look at the original contract, the dates of which had been amended over the years, but it took 10 years. Right. Right. I wrote a couple of smaller books along the way. I think 3 books came out since I signed that contract. But this, as you know, is a entirely different scope, and audience, and required. It's got technical aspects. It's a strange word in certain ways. So yes, and by the way, at some point, I absolutely need to hear more about your book on John, of course, since that's my actual real home, academically.
Yes, that's where I suppose where I first encountered your scholarly work, is your work on John. This book, John's in there as well, of course, big time. I mean, we've got some Mary and Martha in there. We, quite extensively, we've got Mary Magdalene and so on and so on. But you use the word scope there, and that I think is surely one of the most challenging things about writing a book like this, because you're effectively writing something of you have to become an expert in loads and loads of stuff, right? I mean, you talk to some of our colleagues and they'll say, oh, I work on Luke Acts, and that's just like all they work on. But, you have to be, for this, you've had to be an expert on Matthew, on Paul, on John, and for that matter, bits of early Christian literature overall. You have to read a lot of theory. I mean, so I'm surprised it took as little as a decade to work on this alongside other things. So how did you, I mean, was that daunting, that this kind of scope?
It was incredibly daunting. I imagine trying to ever write a project this big again, and it's hard for me to imagine because there's the actual writing of it. But as you said, it's actually a lot more about conceptualizing and getting caught up because our world is so specialized. I'm a Johannine scholar. So yes, about John, the Johannine epistles, and maybe some Revelation, and we can talk. But this, I don't consistently read all the new scholarship out by our colleagues that's cutting edge on, Matthew and Luke and the Deutero-Paul material. So just to get caught up in our own field of New Testament, and as you know, the past decade has seen just an explosion of, questions around methodology, just meta questions and questions of hermeneutics and all the new voices at the table and how you represent that, what your own commitments are as a scholar, and collaboration versus the old school, here's Jamie, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know only through my lens. That's all you need. So yes, it was daunting. And as you know, the problem is, I mean, you should have seen my study, truly hundreds of books in my study, because that's just the New Testament, and then you have to go into the New Testament. And so, you have this feeling that you're trying to resource a very particular audience. And it's my job. I'm the bridge. I'm the go-between. So I need to be the one who's, and I don't even have time to read everything that's written. So how do I choose well what to read? And then there's always that niggling feeling that there's the one important thing that you didn't read.
Oh, absolutely.
I
mean,
yeah.
I go constantly through haunting me about the key things that I'm not reading, and then going lurching from that to the devil may care, because there is no way that I have got time to be, carry on reading, because otherwise I will never get anything out. But you talk there about the audience of the book, and I would, and this is, I want to say to my listeners, many of whom will not have read this book yet, that this is a book for a real broad audience. I think you could go into this knowing nothing about biblical scholarship and learn quite a lot. But equally, you could go in as a graduate student, as a seasoned scholar, as a churchgoer, and get quite a bit from it. But what I wonder about this is, it's one of the hardest things in writing, I think, how to conceptualize your audience and how to write for your audience. And in this, you get the balance so well. But was that difficult to do, to keep it light, but equally make sure there's enough detail there to actually make the points that you're making properly?
Yes, that was one of the biggest challenges, I think, because as you said, it's very clear when we go to SBL and we go to our guild meetings, it's very clear what our genre is and how you do that and what our language is that we speak in our shorthand. It's also fairly clear. So I just have a book out on 1 Corinthians, right, that just came out.
Wow.
And I know that, and that's written for a 6-week Bible study. I do hope people who know the Bible well would learn something, but that's really aimed at 6-week group study, et cetera. That's also fairly clear. But this book is the challenging in between, because it is the series itself, interpretation, as you know, the commentary series and the supplemental volumes, all of which, by the way, are wonderful in their own way. It's aimed at technically, pastors, teachers, and the educated, interested layperson, that kind of tripartite group that we always think about. But as you said, I also, over these 10 years, taught the subject a lot as a way to figure out what are the questions people actually have. Because sitting all by myself in my study at my computer screen, guessing at who the audience might be, picturing them, and guessing at what their questions are, is a hard task. So what I did is just take it on the road to varieties of groups. So clergy, I did a clergy women's retreat. So that was all clergy, female clergy. I've done mixed gender clergy. I've done lay people seminars. And that was crucial, I would say, in helping shape the book, because as academics, we know what's interesting to us and assume, wow, everyone would really want to go down that rabbit trail with me. And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And so, as you can imagine, there's lots of material I did not include that I would
Mm-hmm.
love to have talked about, but I had to, at the end of the day, choose something, and really having real people in front of me. Plus, I'm an extrovert. And so
Mm-hmm.
the worst nightmare for me is sitting alone in my study, just with vague person on the other side. So
Yeah.
real people were crucial for me shaping
Mm.
the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually that's relatively rare in our field to have extroverts, and it actually comes
It's
over in the
not
book.
easy.
Yes, it actually comes over quite. It comes over really well in the book because for people like me, I teach in a, for want of a better term, a secular religious studies department. But I would still feel very comfortable using this with my students, even though you talk about preaching and different groups. And I suppose one way in which I think you do this well is I could illustrate it by giving the example. When you're talking about Luke 7:36 to 50, the woman at Simon the Pharisee's house, and you say that when you deal with that passage in Bible studies and so on, you actually ask people, okay, what makes you think this woman is a prostitute? And you actually ask them that question, and you so now the thing that I thought was great about that is that I have to say mea culpa, because I have actually even assumed that she is a sex worker without even problematizing it. So I just want to say that I think that way of teasing something out and making people think again is very helpful, because it's obviously the product of a conversation, and so that works. I think that works.
Really glad to hear that, especially hearing that you would use it in a classroom outside of a confessional context, because again, I do want it to be used widely. The other issue that constantly comes up is people assume, and I see even someone very dear to me who wrote a kind review on Amazon, which I deeply appreciate. I appreciate that he wrote it, and the title, I think, of the review says something like, buy this for your mother, your aunt, your sister. So I do hope that people give this to their mother, aunt, and sister. But I would really love it if it were just considered a book for all people
Oh my
across all
goodness, yeah.
genders to read and learn about, because it's not really written to just be by a woman for women about women.
Oh my goodness, yeah. We men actually so often have to have our hopefully unconscious sexism pointed out to us. And you have to have the assumptions that you're making and the cultural things that you've inherited. You actually have to be called out on them. So good grief. I think men need to read this much more than the aunts and the mums and that. Not saying that they won't benefit from it too. I find that quite striking. But yeah, because, and that's I suppose what I took away from this. There are all sorts of moments where I thought, I hadn't seen it that way, and that was definitely one of them. And in fact, I wondered with that passage in Luke 7 whether we've got into a bit of a mess with it, because I think there's a certain sector of scholarship, and I'm part of that has been so busy telling everyone this is not Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was not a sex worker, and so on.
Right.
And we're not realizing that what we're doing in the process is reinscribing a really negative way of talking about that unnamed woman in Luke 7, right? And I like the way that you then bring her out, and it's almost like when people working in criminal profiling and so on actually do some victimology. You actually have to say, now hold on a minute, let's just take a look at this particular character for a while.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And again, I also fall into that camp as your fellow New Testament colleague. And I have to say, in writing this book, I also was surprised and learned much from our other colleagues who have thought about things differently. So the book was fun for me that way, because in going outside my normal world, wow, there are so many insights to be had that I now have, that I will incorporate in my own teaching and writing. But yes, I think sometimes it's a good thing what we are doing, right? So we're trying to fix one problem, and we should continue to fix those problems. But again, either we're not problematizing at a larger level, or we're creating another problem. By our zeal and enthusiasm to fix one problem, we don't realize there's an unintended effect that ends up being negative.
Yeah, right. I mean, I suppose a little like the anti-Judaism that has been called out in some feminist scholarship, and again, years and years ago, when someone first pointed that out to me, that was like a light bulb moment. I suddenly realized I'd been doing this. It's sort of saying, well, you might think that Paul's kind of terrible, but you should have seen what the others were like. I mean, it's really awful on, kind of, well, I'm saying that word unconscious again, but unconscious anti-Judaism. I mean, so that's constantly happening in your book. It seems to me that you're aware of certain pitfalls that in the scholarship, and sometimes what you do is just to point them out and say, just look at this bump in the road, look at this problem.
Yes, yeah, and that's what I liked about how I finally figured out to put the Matthew 15 chapter at the beginning of the book. I couldn't figure out where to put that chapter because in a way, in my mind, it belonged in the women in Jesus's ministry chapter, because the woman is a woman in Jesus's ministry. But exactly what you said, and I also didn't feel like, so I took that, as you know, I took that passage and used it for the purposes you're talking about, as a honing in on a certain example of methodology, but also problems. So let's do this methodology to the hilt. Fantastic. And it's better than some of our other interpretations where the woman is just, it's a test of her faith or the disciples' faith. So to see her as a protagonist and doing all this fantastic stuff is good compared to what came before us. So let's do it. And I go ahead and just do it big, right, for the moment in the chapter. And then after everybody's excited and we see that, the benefits of that, then say, okay, and now here's the problem. The Jewish feminists are saying, yay, you fought patriarchy and you did this great thing for women, but in the process, you've now thrown your Jewish siblings under the bus. And trying to figure out a way to do that brings the reader in, that isn't overwhelming and overly technical or depressing, or just throw up your hands. Who can know? It's too complicated. Try to not make it too complicated, but also not try to make it not too simple. That I found really difficult. So I do hope that chapter serves the function you're talking about, because the danger was in writing about the rest of the women in the New Testament or the Bible, you could do what I did with Matthew 15, 28, on pretty much every passage I picked. And that makes for an unwieldy read.
Right. But one thing you do in that chapter, which I really enjoyed, as well as talking about the Canaanite woman, you talk about that extraordinary line that Matthew apparently adds to Mark, where in the feeding of the 5,000, he says, well, there were 5,000 people there, and that's not even including the women and children. And, and you have a really enjoyable breakdown of that. Are we seeing that as really negative? Or are we seeing it as potentially positive, that Matthew's thinking about it? And should we actually start counting them? I think you come up with 35,000 or something like that. The feeding of the, I mean, it made me smile, but it's a serious point as well. And you blended that with the discussion of the Canaanite woman. So it didn't feel heavy as an introductory chapter to me. I liked the way that you went about that.
Well, I'm glad. And that's the trick. I mean, you're a teacher, a celebrated teacher. So, the trick is how to invite people in to where they are so excited. They feel empowered. They don't feel like, wow, this is something I have to have a PhD in New Testament to begin to understand. No, you don't at all. So how to kind of get people excited and also teach as you go. Like, here's the theory of this, but instead just model it. So you, as somebody who knows hermeneutics, when you're reading along, you know exactly what I'm doing. You can identify it. You see the moves I'm making, but you don't have to know that in order to benefit from it and also learn to then replicate it in your own reading habits. So, what I really hope to do is journey alongside people and say, come on in. What if we look at things this way? And then when you finish this book, take these reading habits, the style of reading, these skill sets, and try them out on other things from this day forward on all of your biblical reading. What would it be like?
Yeah.
Ask about, because also even that, the thing about not counting women and children, just the fact that you just said right now that Matthew says there are 5,000 people, but he doesn't, right? He doesn't even say anthropos. He says on air. He literally says,
right. Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
And so you're right. And then to play with it, because I also think in teaching and reading, at least the way I read, and yes, I have a PhD, but also there's a lot of things I don't know about, and I love to read. And I love to read more about things I know little about to learn more. And I also love to read new things that I don't know about. And I'm an intelligent person who is dedicated, but also I don't know that field. And so anything somebody can do to give me something to hang my hat on or latch on to as an example. And so I think, like you said, being a little bit lighthearted, but you are teaching something along the way. So you're also teaching about what are Jewish families like, how many people are in a family, right? We marry, you figure at least this many kids. And so even doing the multiplication, I think it will help that passage stick in their mind as well from this day forward and notice things, but also
absolutely
something about families, and it makes them start to wonder what were families like. And hopefully after they read my book, then they'll go read more about families.
Since we're talking about that chapter, at the beginning of the book, there's something you do there which I really appreciated across this book, is that this book isn't just about bringing to the forefront, bringing into a conversation biblical women, but it's also about bringing to the forefront female scholars in the field. And so you talk a lot about Elaine Wainwright, for example, in that chapter. And I really enjoyed this simply because I only recently read Elaine Wainwright's book on women in the Gospel of Matthew for a piece that I've been writing. And it was one of those experiences where I had to give myself a really good telling off, because this is a really, really strong book that she's written. And why have I never read it? I mean, was I engaged in some kind of marginalizing? I suspect I was. I probably thought, I don't remember ever having come across it until I was actually asking those questions. So now that's just one example, but throughout the book, this isn't just, this is what Professor Clarke-Soles says about biblical women. It's what Professor Clarke-Soles says other scholars, and plenty of male scholars as well. You also introduced me, by the way, to an article by Wayne Meeks that I've never read, the one about the ethical implications of reading about slavery in the New Testament. I'm deeply ashamed to say I've never read that.
He's my doctor father, so
right, okay.
You can imagine I've read everything he's written. So
great. Oh yes. Okay, that's great. Well, so I want to say I think that is something that is really going to help graduate students as well, who are finding their way in the field and are constantly seeing as they go through, oh, I haven't read that. Oh, I haven't seen that. So I appreciate the way that you've amplified the voices of many scholars. I mean, we all know Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza, and Phyllis Tribble and countless others, but you actually have made me aware of a whole bunch of things that I hadn't read before, and some that I still haven't read, but are now on my list, right? So I'm grateful for that.
So, well, and I'm glad you noticed that, and I feel the same way. There were plenty of things that in reading for and writing this book, I had not read or heard of. I'm just going to admit that. And same thing. I like, wow, this has been out here my whole life, and or not my whole life, but even recently. So not just scholars. There's scholars I didn't really know very well, and then there's scholars, as you said, whose names I knew as scholars, but I didn't know this particular work. So that is, as you know, that's one of my stated goals in here, is to expose people to a wide variety of voices, because you and I were both trained, in a certain way that really did privilege a single voice. And it's actually the way our field works and the way our promotion works and all of that, right? Is that to be, are you the one shaping the field? Is it your clear voice? And there's nothing wrong with that. But in terms of resourcing people and exposing them to a variety of viewpoints and teaching a wider array of people just a way of reading, and how beautiful and wonderful it is to have this variety of voices, because we can't all see everything in a passage by ourselves. Just can't. It's not actually possible. So I'm glad that came through really well. I worked on a project in the course of this 10 years. One of the things I did, it's very funny the way I got pushed. I didn't set out to work on women in the Bible, but it just dropped into my life the way I was invited to do things. So there's a resource I was the New Testament editor for, and Judy Fentress Williams is the Old Testament editor, called CEB Women's Bible. So CEB is a certain translation. And it really set a great model for me, because that book we have scholarly essays and study notes and a variety of things, but yes, I'm the New Testament editor and Judy is the Old Testament editor. Yes, we picked the people writing the scholarly introductions, but within that project, there are 80 different female voices. right? And I love that model. And I think that is becoming the kind of move to interdisciplinarity and collaboration. We're hearing these words in our guild. I don't think we fully arrived at that model, but it's becoming, not something that's scoffed at,
Right.
but instead embraced. And as we all get a little more epistemological humility about what we can know on our own and how we need each other to know more.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that's really helpful. I should confess, I suppose, in my reading of the book that I didn't read it in order. I actually didn't. So I was thinking about this when you were talking about agonizing about where to put the Canaanite woman. Actually, it didn't make any difference to me in the sense that I just went straight. I wanted to I've always been fascinated, as many have, with Junior in Romans 16. So I thought, okay, let's find out what she says about her first. And then I've also, because I've written about Mary Magdalene recently, and I've got something else to write. I thought, okay, next we're going to go to Mary Magdalene. So I'm afraid I did do it. But then having done that, I did go back to the beginning. So
well, and one of my purposes that I state in the book is ideally somebody would read it through, but I have structured it so that somebody, because again, if you're a preacher who's preaching a series or a particular text or certain season, you need to be able to dip down,
right,
and just work on that. You can say, okay, fine, ideally, but it's a 309-page book and Sunday's coming. So here's what I need to know, and here's where I need to know where the lectionary helps me. Here's where the lectionary is not going to help me, and I'm going to have to do extra work. So I really did write it that way. And so you'll notice, I noticed in reviewing it before we were meeting, there's a couple of quotes I even used twice, one from Wittgenstein and one about creativity and the ruin of the world. And again, it's because I envision, this is so important to me. If you only were to read this chapter, this concept is important enough for me to just repeat in case you're doing that, not reading it.
Right, got it.
We're not reading the rest of it at all till a year from now, because right now you're working on this sermon series.
Right. And I would say also with assigning readings, we'll do this thing of assigning readings to students. So I tend to teach courses in like, I have a Gospels course, I've got a Life and Letters of Paul course, I've got a non-canonicals course. And so if I was doing Life and Letters of Paul, frankly, I'm not going to assign them anything about Mary Magdalene or anything like that, but I am going to assign them some stuff in Romans 16, so
I just did that myself. I just taught Paul in the spring, which is only Paul, and Gospels in the fall, and all I assigned was the chapter on Paul. Right, because I didn't even assign the chapter on Matthew 15, thinking, oh, they need the methodology chapter.
Right.
What they need right now is something they can actually finish, because I also want them, and I'm sure you teach the same way I do, gone are the days, we don't have time to assign whole books. I mean, what you're trying to do is expose them to a number of scholars and a number of methods. And the only way you can do that is by a number of brief readings, is way better than one long reading by the same person. So I'm with you. And I actually use my own book that way, because I use it in my classes. And I use it that way.
And speaking of that and of the structuring, it was an interesting decision, I thought, a good one, but an interesting decision to have the Deutero-Paulines and the pastorals at the end. And one of the reasons why I think it's a challenging decision is that that's just really tough stuff to deal with, isn't it? I mean, let's be frank about it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm going to say I just always dread having to teach that stuff. I actually I sigh when I do it in a way that I don't if I'm going to be talking about Galatians 3:28 or Romans 16:7 or anything. But I think I think it works, because by that point in reading the book, one has read so much into a whole variety of different ways of looking at biblical women, that when one gets to some of that material, one's already got the context nicely set up for saying, well, actually, why is Paul in inverted commas, saying this stuff when we've just read a whole bunch of stuff about how active these women are in Paul's churches? So I mean, was that a challenge in terms of structuring the book and how to deal with the Deuteros?
Right, because you want to end on a happy note, right? We all know as scholars, we always teach our students, when you're reading Greek, what comes at the very beginning, either of a sentence or a paragraph or anything, whatever comes at the beginning, what comes at the end, or preaching a sermon for that matter,
Mm-hmm.
People remember the most, and it sets the tone. And so you're exactly right, because obviously you can see the red thread through the book is truth and solidarity and hope.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's bedrock for me. If it doesn't attach to hope, it's not Christian by definition for me. And
Mm-hmm.
so that can be a little more challenging, as you said, with the pastorals than
Mm-hmm.
Galatians 3:28 and Romans 16, where it's all fun and games.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a challenge, but again, I took my direction from the way I teach it, and I imagine you teach. That's the way we actually teach it,
Mm-hmm.
right? We do undisputed Paul first,
Mm-hmm.
and then we do it. So the book grew out in part of my own practices, again, teaching outside the classroom in churches and to clergy, but also teaching inside the classroom. And I do think you have to do undisputed Paul before you do. You
Mm-hmm.
have to. There's no getting around it. So, but how you do it at the end of your book, because originally I was going to end with Revelation.
Okay.
Right. I wanted a whole chapter because Revelation, wow, that
Yeah.
chapter.
Yeah.
But there comes a time when the book has to be finished and the page limit
Mm-hmm.
and the word count has been gone over by many thousand words, and you have to stop. So yes, I appreciate your understanding of how difficult that was. I hope though that it came through still, because the fact of the matter is it's in the Christian canon, and it is part of the church's scripture. It's there in the Bible. And so, because a lot of times the move my students will make when they find this liberation, people who have been felt oppressed and put down by the pastoral stuff, or even if they ever read it to my class, and then our first reading, then they start feeling oppressed by it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So how the move they'll tend to make is then, well, Paul didn't write it, and so now who cares? But the fact of the matter is it remains in the Christian canon. And so it is authoritative in a certain way. And we can discuss what that means and how it's authoritative, how it should be authoritative, but it's in there. And that's actually not helpful to yourself as, in terms of Christian formation. And it's certainly not helpful if you're a pastor or a preacher, because it's there. And you need to learn, first of all, how you react to it, and then what you plan to do about it. So I can't remember if I mentioned in the book, that wonderful essay by Francis Young on the ethics of reading. The pastoral epistles, and I use that with my students to kind of reel them back in after they've kind of been like, forget this, Paul didn't write it, I don't even care. So I reel them back in by saying, yes, I too find this very challenging, because I'm also ordained in the Baptist tradition. So if you want to know, I'm ordained in the American Baptist tradition, but Baptist world is one of those worlds where there's issues with women's ordination. So trust me, I live and breathe and hear this passage along with Ephesians 5 repeatedly all the time. So I have my own history with that passage, yet even then we can still approach scripture in a way. Adele Reinhardt does this so beautifully in Befriending the Beloved Disciple.
Right.
I love that book so much.
Yeah, same.
Models. Fine, it's the Gospel of John you're doing there, but what I love about the book and why I use it is that strategy or set of strategies can then be applied to any biblical text we pick up, right? And you can, at the end of the day, disagree and say, okay, I understand the context, and in this day and age, this is one of those texts we don't just plot from the 1st century into the 21st century slavishly going forward. But to kind of try it on for size to read in friendship. If this were your friend and they were having an opinion that you ultimately disagree with, how would you go about listening and hosting that conversation? Would you just put your hand out and say, get out of here, our coffee's over, I'm never speaking to you again? You will disagree probably at the end, but can there still be some relationship, and can it still be a constructive engagement and a constructive encounter? And I certainly hope so. And that's what I aim for in the chapter, but not at the expense of pretending things aren't as complicated as they are.
Right. Well, and one of you are brutally honest, actually, in that chapter about the effect of that. No, there was one bit in that chapter which I was actually quite moved by. I'm going to read it because I think it illustrates how you do not shy away from these difficult issues. This is on page 273 of the book, in the chapter on women in Paul's ministry. Subordination of women not only leads to violence against women, it is violence against women. not to mention violence against the very God who created male and female in God's image. It is no small thing to deface the very image of God. It is no small thing to screw a woman's tongue to the roof of her mouth, whether literally or figuratively. It is no small thing to destroy the image of God, whether in body or in spirit. I mean, that's really powerful stuff. And I just found that arresting. And I actually put the book down at that moment and thought about it. And so I did want to thank you for the way that you don't shy away from saying what needs to be said, at the same time as at other moments in the book, it's not a heavy read. At other moments in the book, it's got kind of light moments and joyful moments and funny moments. But then when you need to say what needs to be said, you say it. But does that make it harder to write, to have to basically, I mean, to use the cliche, to tell it how it is?
Yes, and along with, so I love my little Reading John book, because that, my soul is in that book in a certain way, because that's the world I live in and teach on a lot. But it was an interesting personal journey to write this book. Because again, I too come from a certain social location. And as I just said, I come from one where these issues are still debated hotly and are having real effects daily. So trying to find the balance, and again, there were many drafts. Many drafts, and getting the tone right. Because the thing is, when you're in the certain mood to tell the truth, you tell a lot of truth that night. And then 3 days later, you're in the mood to kind of just be all joy and hope. And people need a word; they need encouragement through these tough times. And so that day, you're all that. Your whole day of writing is just all joy and encouragement, and it's going to be okay, and we're going to change, and it's going to be on earth as it is in heaven. We're marching to Zion. It's amazing. So the trick of writing over such a long period of time as well is getting the whole product to make sense together, and balancing a lot of things, balancing the content, balancing the level of pitch. Because sometimes if I just went to SBL, session on something, you're in a different kind of mode that doesn't match the rest of the book if you come home and write a chapter when you're thinking about one little detail. So it's a great question, Mark, and you've hit upon something really important that I really did experience that as a challenge. So how to balance that tone was one of the biggest challenges of the book, to make it not all this, all that, or even too much this or too much that, but how to do all of these things with integrity. At the end of the day, I asked myself, I want to be able to read this book and feel a sense of integrity. Is this really what I think? How I myself struggle with, exult in these texts. And I do that in a way that's kind of me working through the text and bringing people along with me. Because really what you're seeing in there is my own, how I go about these texts, because they are scripture for me. And I do preach and teach in a confessional context. And I'm also a New Testament scholar. So how do I balance all the sides of me in the book in a way that's useful to others and isn't just a navel gazing project on my part?
Right, absolutely. Can I share one of my favorite images from the book? It's where you talk about going into the church in Magdala, the new church in Magdala, and I've not been there, I have to say, but and you describe 7 columns with named women, but then the 8th column with the unnamed women on it, and you talk about how you take pictures there with your students and so on. Could you just tell the listeners a little bit about that and how that functions for you in telling the story of biblical women?
Yes. So I lead trips often to the Holy Land. In fact, I'm doing one in January 2023 that is only for women, by the way, which is its own issue. Same thing with women in the Bible, who counts as a woman in LGBTQ world, etc. At any rate, so yes, you go into this church, and it's an interesting space in a number of ways. One, because if you go with the narrated guide they have there, it's an interesting challenge, because you go in and it's in the shape of a circle. So you get a lot of this talk about it's an honor of women and a womb, and all of this. Of course, when you go in the sanctuary, it's male dominated space, but that's a separate issue. But in this context, though, as you said, there are these columns, and it's beautiful to me because it honors and names, even has the biblical verses, the references anyway, on the columns in shiny gold of the women. So you stand in the middle and you are surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses of named women in Jesus's ministry. And we always stand under speaking of Mary Magdalene, we always definitely stand there and read the full Mary Magdalene passage. It's the one column named when we read fully. But then there is the one column with no names on it, and it is there to represent all of the unnamed women in Jesus's ministry. And the way I conceptualize that is not only in antiquity, because of course one of the things I point out in the book is, yes, we want to talk about women in the Bible, but I was tempted to call it women in the Bible and not, because also who's missing from this story then in antiquity, in Jesus's own time, and then through all the centuries of Christianity down to today, right? There are women actively, faithfully getting the gospel done, and we will never know their names. And I love that column because I think it's incredibly powerful, and it's personal in a way. You know how we talk about in the Gospel of John, how the beloved disciples never named, and we all love that. So like it's kind of a cipher because it allows the reader to enter the story and be part of the story. That's what I think that column does. It calls to anybody in front of it, to say, where are you in this story? This story continues. It will continue, and you're all to be part of it. And what does that look like for you? So it's especially appropriate, I feel, to have our seminary students there because they're discerning their own vocation in a very real, literal way right here and now. So to have them do that in that space is incredibly powerful. And also for all women, not just the seminary women. It ends up, we take various pictures of and then we take with all the men, but we take various groups of people. And I find it, every time I go, it never gets old, and it never gets less poignant and meaningful and rich to me.
Oh, fascinating. Do you ever name any of the women, like in your imagination or anything like that?
Do you?
Yeah, I do. Well, I do occasionally. So when I'm teaching Mark, I'm so fascinated by the story of Peter's mother-in-law.
Okay.
Where I mean, it strikes me as one of the most marvelously mundane passages in the entire gospel tradition, because really nothing happens. Well, all right, she gets healed, right? But I mean, it doesn't have like the stories like so you go to Mark 5 and you have the woman with the flow of blood and Jairus's daughter. It's so full of these really specific kind of interesting touches, literally touches of the woman of Jesus's garment. And then you have this Peter's mother-in-law, and so I actually like in my teaching just to pose this as a problem to the students. What's it doing there? And then it gets you into discussions about, well, because some students will say, well, maybe, this is Peter's reminiscence, that, when did you first meet Jesus? Or when did you first think Jesus was special? Oh, it was when, Deborah's mother was, and so I'll make up I usually call Peter's wife Deborah. But yeah.
Why? How'd you meet Deborah?
Don't know, it just came out one day when I was teaching.
Okay, maybe one thing I love about Elaine Wainwright giving the Canaanite woman, and I've always meant to reach out and ask if it's pronounced Justa or Justa. I've never heard anybody pronounce it out loud.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. Does she do that? I'd forgotten that. So she gives her a name.
She gives her the name Justa. Again, I don't know if she pronounced Justa or Justa. So I've never said that out loud. I guess I could just think, but I should reach out and find out. I've never heard anybody say it out loud, even though Elaine Wainwright, as a friend of theirs, one thing fascinating to me about her is how she's come back to the story across her career, kind of like you, and you and Moody Smith with the synoptic problem kind of thing. So I like that. So you picked Deborah. It might be kind of fun. Maybe I'll start doing that from now on, to have people, because this is the issue. I think it's just the way the brain works. Sometimes it seems like stories and people are more memorable when you have a name. And that's one of the passages I use. It's only 3 verses long. So fascinating, right? Mark 1.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
That as an exegesis paper. They get a whole 8-page exegesis paper, which surprises them out of that one little passage. But I kind of like that. I wonder how we could start. Maybe I'll just start doing that in my own teaching, because there's something about it.
Well, I'll tell you one of the other ways one of the other reasons that I found myself doing it a bit is because of my love of Jesus films and studying Jesus films.
Okay.
A lot of them are named. So for example, in The Miracle Maker, Jairus' daughter is named Tamar or Tamar. And so ever since watching that 20 years ago, I always think of her as Tamar, and one has to be careful doing this in teaching, because I'm obviously doing it just to sort of excite the historical imagination a little bit. And then if you're not careful, the next thing they've done is they've actually, they're actually writing it down as if it's there. So
it's in their next piece of paper. So
yeah, right. So
like,
yes.
oh no, they're going to go out in the world and say,
yeah. Yes, so one does have to be careful, but to me it's an important exercise in historical imagination. I just wondered that because I found it so striking, and also, I mean, Richard Bauckham wrote that book on gospel women, where he doesn't, I mean, I love that book, but he doesn't talk about the unnamed women, right, which you really make a point of bringing forward, and it's and it does have that very strong feminist point that by looking at them it makes you think even more about those who are not even there mentioned at all. I mean, even another aspect of the Peter's mother-in-law story is that Peter's wife is simply presupposed and not named.
Yeah, I find it incredibly fascinating, and it's funny because that changed, by the way, in the course of writing. It didn't start out to be a feminist work, to be honest. Back then, way back then, I was busy just getting my Johannine scholarship stuff done and establishing myself as a John scholar, so I could get promotion and career things. And so I wasn't extremely well read, and certainly wasn't in the position to be able to claim a feminist scholarship. I didn't know enough yet to really give myself credit for being that. But what happened over time, and to be honest, this is where Thea helped me. I was trying to balance everything. Just make this a book for all people and not make any overt claim. Just present information and data, right, with no clear agenda of any kind. And I did that for the longest time. And there just came a time I was conflicted. It was showing up in the writing. It's like, which is it? Are you actually reading with a liberative lens, where you actually want something in the church, related to women? Or are you really just trying to be a disinterested scholar presenting, well, some scholars say this, some people say this about 1 Timothy 2 and women in the church. Some people think women shouldn't be ordained. Some people should. That was for the longest how I approached it. Right? So that anybody from any tradition, even if you're against ordaining women, would feel happy to have this book and all of that. And it finally, it just wasn't really working, honestly. And it wasn't making for a very interesting book in a certain way, because the fact of the matter is, especially my own convictions became clearer and clearer to me, over the decade. And it just wasn't working. So finally, Thea just said, just name it. I mean, just be honest about it, though. I mean, write down in there and let the reader know. Yes, I know I'm doing this. I'm reading with this. I'd never had anything about the patriarchy, and I was doing the thing with heterarchy, right? That's how because I was using that to we don't want to be extreme, And then I just decided people need help. There's a lot of stuff to wade through. People are really busy, and it's my job to go ahead and just say, here's what I think. I don't think benevolent patriarchy is a thing.
Right.
And just go ahead, but not do it in a way that is off-putting, shuts people down, alienates, but invites. That was one of the hardest parts of it, and that was a big shift in the book. The early version of the book, and I think it probably is why it took a lot longer, because that's a certain different kind of project to say some people think this, blah blah blah. Some people think this. Next chapter. And because I think there are times in our own guild and all of that, when we're at SBI, I think you are supposed to say, here's the data that I've seen and here's what it looks like. We can test that. But then I decided the audience for this book, that's not really actually what they need from me.
Right.
And if my voice is there, I also hope that what they feel is welcome to and disagree with me at any place. Like I teach that way. Right. I'm going to say strong things. I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. I have convictions and I'm an extrovert. So there's that I'm just going to say things, and you need to always feel free to question it. Say, is it really that intensely so? But I think it helps the reader for me to come through in this book as a person. as an actual person with a
Mm.
whole body person living in the world we live in now, right? In 2020, and then they can take issue with that. So yeah, I went ahead and just embraced that. And it's interesting because this is also the first interpretation book, by the way, that's an audio book. So I
Cool.
this to be an audio book. Yeah, it's the only one in the series. And I went through lots of people. You know, the person who did Where the Crawdads Sing? Have you read Where
No,
Do you know that novel? That's very
I've heard of it, but I'm afraid I've not read it.
So she's even one of the people who read. It was so interesting having listened to that book and then hear her reading, my violence against women, because I had the readers read from the violence against women chapter, because that has to be read correctly. And anyway, I didn't go with that author. I ended up handpicking an author. But yeah, and I also noticed in kind of skimming it for today, I use a couple of contractions. Normally we would write on all paper, no contractions, informal, right? So yes. I feel happy that the editors honestly let me come through with that kind of voice in such an lofty, esteemed series.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's wonderful, and I'm sure that my listeners will be delighted to hear there's an audio book version of it, because obviously this is an audio medium we're working in at the moment.
Right, and the other reason I did it is because I have, and this reading the book, I have very deep convictions. There's a few things, no matter where I go, what the context is, and what the topic is, and disability is one of them.
Right.
That I will always draw attention to. Disability in the Bible is just one of the things I'm always going to bring up in any conversation. And so it's awkward to me to have a book that talks about disability and all of that, and then not have things that are accessible, full of varied embodiments. And so to me, to be honest, not to kind of be too over the top, but it's a justice issue. And I find it ironic if I'm talking in here about disability, and then there are people who can't access the book,
right,
that talks about them accessing books.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's really appreciated, and I appreciate the shout out as well. I mean, one of the reasons I've enjoyed doing this podcast over the years is occasionally I'll get emails from people who so people with visual impairments. I know that a lot of the time they're so used to listening to a dull computer voice reading stuff out to them. And one person said to me a few years ago how nice it is actually to hear like a real voice talking and not machine reading. So I really appreciate your saying that, actually, because I think we don't think about these issues enough at all in the field.
And for the first time ever, this is not related to the book, but this is just us now as New Testament scholars. So I'm teaching Greek this year, and I have a student with visual impairment in my class. So I've just learned a ton. We can talk at some other time. I've learned a ton now about how I'm going to teach Greek. There are ways to do it, but it's opened up a whole new world to me. And I'm like, wow, we should be what ends up happening is when you make things available to folks who have various disabilities, it advantages everybody.
Yes.
Right? Everybody,
yes,
people learn different ways. People even who are sighted, some people are audio learners, even if they have their sight. So it is very important. And I hope that, it's ironic, you're working on John right now, which I do want to hear more about. So I just taught John this semester, and we do John 9 with the man with the visual impairment. And also, by the way, the language itself is highly contested. So there is, even within the community, there's debate over the language, but that's person first language that I'm using with you. But sometimes people with disabilities are against person first language, because then they feel like, so you want to be, again, this is the thing we were talking about earlier, and trying to be aware and inclusive, it creates other issues. So you're trying to do person first language. That idea is the person is more than their disability, right? So the person with something. But there are folks with visual impairment and deaf people who want to be called deaf or blind, because erasing a disability is not helpful to them for justice either. Sure. So anyway, that's a contested area anyway. So I was teaching John, and there's a book written on Then There Was Darkness. It's written by a man who is blind, working through the passages in the Bible. He really hates John chapter 9, defines it like completely useless if you're but it's ironic that book is not available as an audio book.
No way.
He is blind, and the book is on blindness, and it is not available.
Oh gosh.
As an audio book.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a ways to go.
Yeah, we have. One footnote to what you're saying earlier on. I should explain to listeners that when you refer to Thea, you're presumably talking about Anathea Portier Young. She's a colleague of mine in the graduate program in religion at Duke University. So it's good to have a shout out to one of my colleagues.
It is, and speaking of learning, because since she's an Old Testament scholar, you can imagine how much I learned from her and her own essay on Ezekiel 16. Again, just opening up whole world. So I think it's encouraging. I hope it's inspiring to your listeners that you and I, right, we do this for a living. We're paid to do this, and there's so much for us to learn. It's always exciting, never gets old. You never learn it all. And that's not a depressing thing. It's actually a really exciting thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We've been talking for some time, so we must draw it to a close. Thank you so much, Jaime, for coming on the podcast. It's been a wonderful conversation, and it's a really super book, and I recommend it to all my listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It means a lot to me, and I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Cheers. Thanks so much to Jaime Clarke-Soles for joining us on the NT Pod. Absolute pleasure to talk to, and I could have continued to chat all day. I'm sorry that the audio isn't quite even across the two of us. It was recorded using Zoom, which isn't always the best way of doing things, but is all we had available at the time to record on. But it was a real pleasure to have her on the podcast. The book is called Women in the Bible. It came out in 2020, in December 2020, from Westminster John Knox Press. And I should say that she's authored lots more excellent work on the New Testament, and I strongly recommend her scholarship to you all. You can find this podcast on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can find me on the web at markgoodacre.org, and you can find the podcast on Facebook and on Twitter. Just search for NT Pod. Thanks so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to have your company. Bye-bye.